I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of how grateful I am to my host, Professor Arlie Loughnan I, who's made it possible for me to be here, and I've been really enjoying my time. It's wonderful to connect with old friends and to meet new friends. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments on the paper. As Arlie has given me to understand, I have about 20 minutes, so what I thought I would do is talk to you in a meta way at the start about the kind of impetus for this project and this paper, and then dive into it to give you a bit of a flavour of what it is that I'm trying to do here. So as you may have gathered, if you've had a chance to read the paper, this is a sort of an outline of a project that I'm commencing, and it's forward-looking in that sense. So rather than talk about what I've already done, I'm trying to cash out to kind of work out what I need to do to execute this project. And as I explained to Galia in our lovely conversation just now, this is a project, this is a paper that is the kind of intellectual companion to a grant application. And as I imagine it might be similar here, the holy grail, if I can use that expression, of academic life in Australia is to buy yourself out of teaching. And as a result, people put a lot of effort into grant applications. This particular grant application was not successful. So the plus side of that is that I have the opportunity here now to, with you guys, begin to think again about my own thinking again about criminal law and empire. So a chance, I hope, to kind of push this project forward, even in its kind of nascent state. So, thinking again about criminal law and empire. The first part of the paper is a kind of a why should we bother excursion, making the case for the value of doing this kind of project. And then the second part of the paper is an attempt to sketch out the parameters of that research, how it might look, position the work both in relation to existing criminal law scholarship, but also in as far as I can, in relation to existing historical scholarship on criminal law, on empire, the British Empire in particular. I think there's a challenge in this work, and I'm going to say that challenge right up front, so you can all tell me, yes, you're right, think again about it and do something else, or we can think together perhaps about how to overcome the challenge. I think the challenge is that criminal law theory, the academic field in which I find myself, is divided between traditional legal philosophical approaches to criminal law and more critical, interdisciplinary, socio-historical approaches on the other hand. And Galia and I find ourselves in that latter space. But the challenge even there, I think, is that this project is indeed very historical. So it's an attempt to look at the development of the criminal law over time. And perhaps for the body of scholars to whom I hope to talk, that would kind of make it already an outsider project. But I don't want to let go of my ambition to talk to those very people. And I think, as Galia and I have discussed, that makes it challenging, because what you have to do is try and find your own pathway into the kind of the core debates, I suppose, even if you come from a position of the outsider. And I would define myself as that simply to the extent that the kind of insider voices are the legal philosophical voices in this space. And they're, as I mentioned in the paper, the dominant kind of dominant in the field of criminal law theory. So that's a disclaimer. Hopefully you'll all still think it's not too historical or to be not of relevance, but it'll be something I think I need to think about in the kind of life of the project. So let's dive into the paper itself. The modern criminal law, broadly understood as the criminal law that we can recognise in our own systems now, something that kind of took shape gradually but maybe more coherently from around the turn of the 19th century, is intimately tied up with empire, with the British Empire. Both projects are modern, systematising projects that connect not only people, very importantly people I think, but practices around the rule of law, jurisdiction, and kind of an idea of liberal modernity. And yet, in criminal law scholarship, there's been a kind of failure to take that seriously. And this, as I am sort of suggesting, is something that reflects the reflects the tenor of scholarship in the field at the moment, and that is the dominance of legal philosophical approaches to the criminal law. This is combined with a kind of what I've called in other work a default northern orientation, the orientation of the scholarship around certain jurisdictions, which then become effectively interchangeable and jurisdictional specificity is lost. And this means that some aspects of positive law are kind of mixed up with other aspects of positive law to create either a generalist or even universalist account of criminal law in the theoretical tradition in which of which I'm a part. But that really strong legal philosophical approach to criminal law has produced its own critical response, and the critical scholarship is now, I think, a very vibrant part of the scholarly terrain. And that, represented here by Eli, I think we could say, and myself and Galia, tries to kind of respond to those dominant traditions with embodied, located, historicised, contextualised criminal law work that nonetheless aspires to have theoretical content. So given the state of the field, I think it's then a question of making a case for looking at criminal law and empire. If criminal law scholarship is dominated by the legal philosophical tradition, it's necessary to kind of say something about why this type of project might be valuable. At base, part of the importance of empire in the criminal law is it's the reason that scholars who are working on criminal law theory speak the same language. And I don't mean English, but rather common law. It speaks the language of mens rea, actus reus, and other sort of features of the law that enable us to have conversations across jurisdictions. And beyond that, we can see that there are some points of connection or interlinking between the criminal law and empire. And here, perhaps the most obvious one is jurisdiction. Jurisdiction, broadly the idea of law occupying physical space, or the way the law governs physical space, is an idea that is cemented through the British Empire's tenuous links or trajectories around the globe. So jurisdiction is kind of intimately tied up with the administration of empire, the idea that space and law go together. And this, I think, has been helpfully analysed by Lindsay Farmer, who writes that the idea of jurisdiction that had a body of norms applied consistently across space was connected to the spread of the administration of the British Empire across the globe. By the 1800s, jurisdiction as territory, as legal space, as physical space, encompassed the idea of imperial territory, where people took the law with them. The idea that the common law was a gift of civilization brought by the British as they travelled around the world. And this idea is connected with the early Victorian ideas of liberal imperialism, in which the civilising potential of the criminal law spread outwards from the centre of empire through British administration. I think there's more to say about that idea of spreading outwards, but I'll come back to that. Another dimension of the modern criminal law and empire that's been mapped in the scholarship is in relation to codification. And codification has a particularly important place in modernity because it's associated with the production of universal, complete bodies of rules that replace all pre-existing norms. With this, codification becomes a story that's interconnected with empire, because the codification of criminal law in England and Wales is a never achieved project. And so codification in places like India is then a practice or a set of developments that are connected to empire, and particularly to the failure of the British to codify their own criminal law. And what that means is that codification has been understood in particular in relation to developments in the local space in which the code occurs, but also at home in the English context in which the common law remains uncodified. And in my own work in criminal responsibility, I've attempted to connect some of the ideas about the development of criminal responsibility principles and practices to empire. My previous project worked on the development of criminal responsibility in the Australian context over the 20th century. And in that period, I was able to see some of the importance of borrowings and lendings around criminal responsibility practices, the way in which those practices might find their corollary in another jurisdiction, another part of the Commonwealth, and might be, if you like, refracted in a particular Australian context. And I made a theoretical case for understanding, or I made an argument for understanding criminal responsibility as relations of responsibility, relations between self, others, and the state, the title of the book, recognising that criminal responsibility shows that this way of approaching criminal responsibility shows that it is the means by which subjectivity, relationality, and power make themselves felt in criminal law. So this previous work and the current work on jurisdiction and codification is really intriguing, I think, but not satisfying, because what it tends to do is create empire as a set of uniform spaces where the predominant trajectory is from the centre outwards. So even though there's a recognition that the criminal law, for instance, changes in colonial space, there's no sense, I think, about the way in which different colonial spaces interacted separate from the relationship from the metropole. And I think it doesn't give enough play to the idea of variegated spaces, to use variegated legal geographies, to use Lauren Benton's word, the idea that empire itself had multiple types of legal space, and that this, I think, is an important thing to understand when we come to think about the development of the modern criminal law. So there seems to me to be more to say about the connections between criminal law, modern criminal law, and empire, and it's my hope that, funded or not, this is the project to say those additional things. Okay, so how to do the project. There's a part of the paper here now about how to frame this research, and it's divided into two parts. One is the general parameters for the research, and the other are specific parameters. And the general parameters are ones that just locate the project, if you like, in scholarly space. But the second set of parameters are those that locate it in relation to the existing criminal law scholarship, so it's more sort of specific, I think. The first one of the general parameters is time frame, and here, obviously the idea of the British Empire, even if I look at it only in fairly scoped terms, could be an enormous length of time and an impossible project for one person. My plan is to look at the development of the modern criminal law as its frame, to give the frame to the study. So to use about the turn of the 19th century as the kind of starting point for the study, and then to think about an endpoint as roughly open, but sometime around the mid-20th century. And the reason for that is to move beyond the kind of constitutional developments that associate independence in the former dependent colonies of Africa and Asia as the kind of denouement of colonialism, or of empire, but rather to allow for some of the sort of nebulous but I think important dimensions of the way colonial legacies played out. So for instance, the idea of the British Commonwealth, of which Australia is a part. And I want to kind of also, I think about the way in which institutional dynamics allowed for the continuation, if you like, of certain colonial practices. And I'm thinking here about institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, and the way in which those particular institutions use their status among other institutions in England and Wales to kind of recruit scholars from the Commonwealth who went there to study civil servant exams and those kinds of things. And I think that's an interesting kind of institutional kind of trajectory of this project, or dimension of this project. And I give an example in the paper of one such institution, which is BICL, as it's called, the British Institute for International Comparative Law, which was formed in 1958. And I don't know if people who know this, institution, but it's located in the heart of London at Russell Square. And it was designed to create a kind of hub for the study of Commonwealth law. So both Commonwealth scholars, but also judges and practitioners could come to this institute from around the world. And initially it published an annual survey of Commonwealth law, literally a survey where there was this questionnaire sent out and people were required to fill it in the colonial jurisdiction, and then it was put together and published for the consumption of other parts of the colony, so a kind of an educative function. That fell away with the rise of Commonwealth law reports and textbooks, but it was an important feature, I think, of the attempt to counter the rise of the US and the USSR in the context of legal power. And this kind of mid-century effort to, if you like, almost revitalise empire was, I think, an important part of global politics after World War II, and it was the background to the Cold War. And I think this, in turn, suggests something of the importance of contemporary importance of the British Empire for our legal understanding. The second general parameter of the project is scope, how wide. And of course, as someone said to me in talking about this paper, this could be the rest of my academic life. So I better find a way of scoping it down. And so my thought here is to focus on the settler colonies. And there's two motivations for that. One is because they are the colonies with which I'm most familiar. They have a kind of a connection between each other, which makes it possible for me to study them in a roughly comparative or informally comparative way. And so those are the sort of motivations. And then to attempt in that study to kind of foreground those settler colonies and background other dimensions of empire, but without ignoring them. So one of the risks this part of the project plays is that it repeats or recreates a division of empire into settler colonies and colonies, dependent colonies, and that has been, I think, in recent scholarship, historical scholarship, kind of critiqued. But for the project to be doable for one person, it seems necessary to find some kind of way of foregrounding and backgrounding different dimensions of settler colonies. And one of those, one of the points of value of doing that is that I think it will help me to see important connections between criminal law developments and the developments of Westminster-style parliamentary systems in certain contexts. So Canada, New Zealand, Australia and South Africa, the settler colonies, were at a particular time, were colonised at particular times when parliamentary systems or Westminster-style democracy institutions were not well developed. And so what that means is that I think there's interesting points of connection between criminal law and criminal law institutions and those political institutions. For instance, in the Australian context, the police were the first public institution, if you like, and the largest for a long time. And what this means, I think, is that contrast the British context, one can see interesting and valuable roles for, or value in connecting developments in the Australian colony with those in Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, etc., to show, I hope, interesting perspectives on criminal law. And the third general parameter is interdisciplinarity. I hope it will come as no surprise to this audience that I think that's an essential dimension of the study of criminal law and empire. But perhaps if there was a traditional legal philosopher in the room, they might wonder about this. But I think it's the only way to approach such a topic, because obviously this sort of topic demands consideration of political economy, criminology, politics, etc. And I think that it would be an important aspect of the project to try to take into account some of those interdisciplinary dimensions. And I say more about that in the paper. Specific parameters, there are 3, and here this is an attempt to locate the project in relation to criminal law scholarship in particular. The first specific parameter is about legal space, and traditionally criminal law has been concerned with the space of the nation state. The connection between the criminal law and the nation is evident in systems that are coextensive with national boundaries, so the Israeli Criminal Code, for instance, the Canadian Criminal Code, but in the Australian context, criminal law is subnational, in the sense that it's still state-based. But I think what we need to do is go above the nation in some sense in the criminal law and empire story, because the British state was, of course, an imperial power for the entire time that the modern criminal law was developing. And this means that we need to think about it, if you like, state, in a context, a global context of other states. And to some extent, we also need to go beneath the state in that context, because some of the developments that are important to the modern criminal code are sub-jurisdictional. And I go in the paper into a discussion of interstitial spaces that are prior to or inchoate in some way, official or proper, legitimate legal space. And of course, the common law is itself a broader than national power and an empirical force, not only a force for good, as the advocates of empire would suggest, but also a force of violence and repression in the colonial context. And I give an example of a kind of non-state institution through which we might study some of these non-traditional spaces, and that's the Privy Council, and I can say more about that if people are interested. My second last parameter is genealogies of influence, and here I'm trying to think about the people of empire. And it won't surprise this audience, I think, although it still shocks me, the number of connections between the story of empire, whether it be theoretical, political, or administrative, and the story of the modern criminal law is really striking. So people like Blackstone, Macaulay, Maine, all these individuals featured not only in the development of modern criminal law, but in the development of the British Empire. And so I think it's important to kind of read them in that light, and a lot of work in this area has already been done. What I might do to build on it is to think about the legacy of these great men, the flow-through, if you like, of their role in empire. And here I've got an example from the mid-20th century where I look at the role of H.L.A. Hart and Glanville Williams at Oxford and Cambridge respectively, who recruited students from all around the common law world and who then imbued in them their ideas about, say, for example, codification of criminal law or principles of subjectivism or whatever it might be, and then for whom those individuals were, if you like, kind of advocates that went out into the world with those ideas in their minds. And I think there's an interesting story to tell about genealogies of influence in the role of the modern criminal law. Last specific parameter in relation to this project is ideas. And here I'm thinking about the way in which empire refracted or even reconstructed certain core ideas of modern criminal law. So, for example, the rule of law, liberalism, the kind of ideas that are now hallmarks of modern criminal law, but in the context of empire look either limited or even perhaps incoherent. And so those ideas are something that I want to try to incorporate into the study of modern criminal law and empire. The last thing to say here is that as this is the beginning of the project, I think there's lots of ways in which this might develop. And I am wedded, I suppose, to doing a kind of bottom-up study that looks at the law on the ground and then seeks to go up from there to think about its relevance. And so I'm conscious that the jurisdiction I know the best, the Australian jurisdiction, is only going to be one part of this particular project. But I'm very keen to hear from you all about the ways in which one might seek to develop this idea, either to change it or hopefully to make it better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.